USS Washington, the 7 minutes that changed naval warfare forever. It is November 15th, 1942, exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, and the waters of Iron Bottom Sound are completely dark. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Washington, radar operators watch their screens in the red twilight. On the green phosphorescent display in front of them, a large contact glows against the darkness, 8,400 yards away, bearing 330 degrees. The radar signature is unmistakable. It is a battleship. The Japanese ship is moving slowly through the darkness, heading northwest toward Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, completely unaware that American guns are locked on its position at this exact moment. She does not know she is being tracked. She cannot see the Washington. In fact, she does not even know that the Washington exists. Minutes earlier, 4 American destroyers were torn apart in brutal combat with Japanese forces. They are sinking or burning right now. The USS South Dakota, the other American battleship, was beaten into retreat after catastrophic electrical failures that left her blind and defenseless against concentrated Japanese fire. Japanese searchlights are sweeping the water now, looking for more American targets to illuminate and destroy, but miraculously they cannot find the Washington. The Japanese battleship Kirishima depends entirely on optical rangefinders and highly trained lookouts to find its enemies in the darkness. These men have been trained for years in night combat, but on this moonless night their superior training means nothing. They have absolutely no idea that an American battleship is less than 8 kilometers away, with its guns pointed directly at their ship. On the bridge of the Washington, Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee understands radar better than any flag officer in the United States Navy. He has tracked the entire Japanese force on radar for the past 20 minutes and knows exactly where each enemy ship is positioned. The Japanese know absolutely nothing about his presence. What happens in the next 7 minutes will change naval warfare forever, proving that the era of visual combat is over and the era of electronic warfare has begun. In November 1942, if you asked any naval officer in the world who dominated the night, there was only one answer: the Imperial Japanese Navy. For more than 2 decades, the Japanese had systematically perfected tactics that transformed darkness from an obstacle into their most powerful weapon. 3 months earlier, in August 1942, the Battle of Savo Island demonstrated exactly how dangerous the Japanese were in the darkness. Japanese cruisers sank 4 heavy cruisers in just 32 minutes of savage combat. The American ships had primitive radar systems installed, but the commanders did not trust the technology. When the lookouts finally got visual identification of the Japanese ships, it was already too late. The USS Chicago detected the Japanese contacts at 43,000 yards on radar, more than 30 kilometers away. But the information took so long to reach the decision-makers that by the time someone was informed, the Japanese ships were already close enough to be seen with the naked eye. The radar warning provided no advantage whatsoever. This could not continue. The Navy was losing ships and trained men faster than they could be replaced. Guadalcanal represented the first American offensive operation of the entire Pacific War. If this campaign failed, the entire strategy would be questioned. Henderson Field was the absolute lifeline of the Marines. Without that operational airfield, the Marines simply could not hold their positions. Admiral William Halsey faced a choice that would give anyone nightmares. His cruiser force had been destroyed. He had exactly 1 operational aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise, but carrier aircraft were useless in night combat. His only realistic option was to send his battleships into Iron Bottom Sound for another night battle against the Japanese. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee was different from his peers in ways that would prove decisive. Lee was 54 years old in November 1942. What Willis Lee was known for, what had made him slightly famous even outside naval circles, was that he was possibly the best marksman in the world. At the Antwerp Olympics in 1920, Lee won 7 medals in shooting competitions, 5 golds, 1 silver, 1 bronze. He was the most successful athlete of those entire games. Through years of competitive shooting at the highest levels, Lee developed an almost intuitive understanding that hitting targets at distance required absolutely precise measurement and rigorous calculation. Lee recognized, earlier than most of his peers, that radar could provide better data with more accuracy and more reliability than human operators with optical instruments could ever hope to achieve. Optical rangefinders worked by comparing images from 2 lenses separated by several meters. Under ideal conditions, clear day, well-defined target, accuracy could reach 1% of the measured range at best. In darkness, optical rangefinders became dramatically less accurate or completely useless. Radar, on the other hand, measured range by timing how long it took for radio wave reflections to return to the receiver. The measurement was instantaneous, completely electronic, and totally unaffected by darkness, smoke, rain, or any other visibility condition. The Mark III fire control radar installed on the Washington could measure range with an error of less than 54 yards at 10,000 yards, almost twice as accurate as the best optical rangefinder in perfect daylight conditions. In August 1942, Lee received command of Battleship Division 6. He made the Washington his flagship and immediately began an intensive training program focused on radar-directed gunnery. His approach was genuinely radical for the time. Lee made radar the primary sensor for the Washington, not a backup system. He reorganized the ship's fire control procedures so that radar operators worked directly with the gun directors. Lee trained his crews constantly in procedures that most of the Navy considered experimental at best. Track targets on radar, even when you cannot see them. Calculate firing solutions entirely from radar data. Fire the main battery without any visual confirmation of the target. Trust the electronics more than your own eyes. The test for which Lee had been preparing arrived on November 14, 1942. Intelligence reports indicated that Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo was bringing a large bombardment force toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese force was substantial, the battleship Kirishima with 8 14-inch guns, heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, light cruisers Sendai and Nagara, and 9 destroyers. Admiral Halsey ordered Lee to take Task Force 64 north into Iron Bottom Sound and stop this bombardment force as he could. Lee's force consisted of USS Washington, USS South Dakota, and only 4 destroyers. 6 American ships against 15 Japanese ships. Lee's tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. The 4 destroyers would form a screening line ahead of the battleships. The battleships would remain in the darkness, where Japanese visual methods could not locate them, using their radar to track Japanese capital ships beyond visual range. Lee would wait until the geometry was right. Then the Washington would open fire with radar-directed salvos while remaining invisible to the enemy. At 11:00 p.m., with total darkness over the tropical waters, Lee's force rounded the western tip of Guadalcanal and headed north into Iron Bottom Sound. The night conditions were almost perfect for radar and absolutely terrible for visual observation. There was no moon in the sky. Visibility was estimated at less than 1 mile. For the Washington's radar operators, these were ideal conditions. For Japanese lookouts trying to see through the darkness, these conditions made their jobs almost impossible. Lee sent a concise radio message to all ships in his formation. "This is Lee. We're going into a big fight. Keep your heads. Stay alert. Trust your instruments." They were characteristically understated words from an officer who did not waste words, but those final 3 words, "trust your instruments," carried the weight of Lee's entire tactical philosophy. Commander Thomas Fraser aboard the USS Walker had the most advanced radar in the destroyer force. His radar operators picked up the Japanese destroyer screen at approximately 12,000 yards. Fraser requested permission from Admiral Lee to launch torpedoes. But Lee refused Fraser's request. Lee understood that in the confused darkness of a night battle, no one could possibly track where all the torpedoes were. Lee ordered his destroyers to engage with guns only. The Japanese destroyer Ayanami detected the American ships first at approximately 11,000 yards, using nothing but trained eyes and excellent optical equipment. Commander Sato immediately launched a salvo of 8 Type 93 torpedoes. These torpedoes, called Long Lance by the Americans, were simply the best torpedo weapons in the world at that time. After launching his torpedoes, Sato ordered his searchlight operators to illuminate the lead American destroyer. The beam found the Walkie almost immediately. Ayanami opened fire with her 5-inch guns, and the light cruiser Nagara also opened fire. Walkie was being hit before Fraser could fully react. At 11:26 p.m., a Japanese shell penetrated Walkie's forward magazine. The explosion was absolutely catastrophic. The entire forward section of the ship disintegrated instantly. The Walkie broke into 2 pieces. 76 men were killed instantly. The USS Preston was behind the Walkie. Commander Storms saw the lead destroyer literally explode into fragments right in front of him. Preston opened fire, but was hit almost immediately. At 11:30 p.m., a long-lance torpedo hit Preston's starboard side. The massive explosion literally broke the destroyer's keel. Preston sank bow first. 116 men died. The USS Benham was hit by a long-lance torpedo that tore off the entire forward section of the ship. About 60 feet of the ship were removed by a single torpedo hit. But Benham had extraordinary luck. The torpedo hit forward of the main watertight bulkhead. Benham remained afloat all day on November 15th, stubbornly refusing to sink. In just 15 brutal minutes of combat, the American destroyer screen had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. But the destroyers had fulfilled their mission at a terrible cost in ships and lives. Now everything depended entirely on the Washington using its radar advantage. The USS South Dakota was maneuvering when the destroyer action erupted in violence. At 11:38 p.m., the South Dakota's entire electrical system failed catastrophically, and the ship went completely dark. The failure was caused by a combination of human error and poor electrical system design. Everything went completely dark. Radar screens went blank. Gun directors lost power. At 12:01 a.m., power was partially restored, but during the crucial minutes when South Dakota was without power, the ship had drifted significantly. When her systems came back, they discovered, horrified, that South Dakota had sailed to approximately 5,000 yards from the main Japanese force. The Japanese heavy cruiser Atago detected the American battleship at this close range and immediately illuminated her with a powerful searchlight. Every Japanese ship within range could see her clearly and immediately opened fire with everything they had. The Kirishima fired her main battery of 14-inch guns. South Dakota was hit at least 27 times in just 3 minutes of concentrated fire. 39 men were killed. 59 more were wounded. But South Dakota's heavy armor did exactly what it was designed to do. None of the hits penetrated the truly vital spaces. Captain Gatch ordered an emergency turn to escape from the Japanese formation. South Dakota disappeared back into the protective darkness. The Japanese commanders actually thought they had won the battle. In less than 20 minutes of combat, they had destroyed or driven off every American ship they had engaged. What the Japanese commanders did not know was that the USS Washington still existed and was very much present in the fight. Washington had deliberately remained in the darkness, tracking absolutely everything on her radar and patiently waiting for the absolutely perfect moment to open fire. Admiral Lee was on the Washington's bridge using a headset that connected him directly to the radar and fire control circuits. He was watching the complete tactical situation with perfect clarity. The position of every ship movement, the geometry of the entire engagement shown in bright green dots of light on the circular screen. He could see the Japanese battleship clearly on the radar display. Range, 8,400 yards. The target was moving slowly to the northwest, heading directly toward Henderson Field, completely unaware that it was being tracked by an enemy it could not see. Lee had achieved the absolutely perfect tactical setup. His ship was invisible to the enemy. His target was fully illuminated on radar. His guns were loaded and ready. Lee looked at Captain Davis and said simply, calmly, "Stand by, Glenn. Here they come." Captain Davis gave the order that would change everything. Main battery, commence firing. At exactly 1 a.m. on November 15, 1942, the USS Washington opened fire with her main battery. All 9 16-inch guns in 3 turrets fired together in a single massive salvo that lit up the entire sky. 9 armor-piercing shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, flew toward the Kirishima at approximately 2,600 feet per second. The shells were in the air for approximately 20 seconds as they covered the 8,400 yards to the target, following carefully calculated trajectories that would bring them down on the deck and hull of the enemy ship. The Washington's first salvo hit the Kirishima with devastating accuracy. At least 2 16-inch shells, possibly 3, struck the Japanese battleship. 1 shell penetrated the armored deck near turret number 3 and exploded inside the ship. Another hit struck near the waterline on the starboard side. The explosions inside the hull created enormous holes that allowed seawater to flood several compartments. Washington fired again, and again, and again. In 7 minutes of continuous fire, Washington fired 9 complete salvos from her main battery, 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition in total, plus 107 rounds of 5-inch from her secondary battery. The fire control team was tracking the target perfectly on radar, continuously updating the firing solution as both ships moved. The Kirishima was dying. 16-inch shells continued to hit the ship, each impact causing enormous damage. Compartments throughout the forward part of the ship were flooding uncontrollably. The list to starboard increased steadily. Power systems failed throughout the ship. Captain Iwabuchi ordered the ship to turn north, trying to escape this incomprehensible punishment. At 1:07 a.m., just 7 minutes after Washington first opened fire, Admiral Lee ordered ceasefire. The Kirishima was clearly doomed. The ship was sinking and no longer posed a threat to the bombardment mission. There was no reason to continue firing on a ship that was already dying. At 3:00 a.m., 3 hours after the battle began, Admiral Lee ordered Task Force 64 to withdraw to the south. The mission had been accomplished completely. The Kirishima was sinking. The Japanese bombardment of Henderson Field had been stopped. The airfield was safe. At 3:25 a.m., Kirishima finally rolled over and sank. 212 men sank with the ship. The Kirishima sank approximately 7.5 miles northwest of Savo Island, in water more than 2,000 feet deep, and remains there to this day. The USS Washington had accomplished something that no other American battleship would achieve during the entire Second World War. She had defeated an enemy battleship in a one-on-one surface engagement. But far more important, Washington had proven beyond any possible doubt that radar could completely dominate naval combat in conditions where visual observation was impossible. Captain Davis wrote in his action report, "Radar forced the captain or officer in tactical command to base a greater part of his actions on what he is told rather than what he can see." This represented a genuinely revolutionary change in how naval command worked. For literally centuries, Naval commanders operated by looking at the enemy fleet and making decisions based on visual information they personally observed. Now commanders would sit inside enclosed spaces inside their ships and make critical tactical decisions based on electronic displays. The Navy began to develop formal procedures for organizing and managing radar information aboard ships. In January 1943, the Navy had formally designated these spaces as Combat Information Centers, the CIC, and developed doctrine for how they should be manned and operated. The CIC concept was developed directly from the lessons learned in the Guadalcanal campaign and particularly from the Washington's battle. The impact of these changes became dramatically clear in just 1 year. In November 1942, American forces were barely holding their own in night surface battles against the Japanese. In November 1943, just 12 months later, Japanese ships were actively avoiding night engagements with American forces. 3 major night surface actions in the second half of 1943 demonstrated how much things had completely changed. The Japanese desperately tried to adapt to this new reality, but they were simply too far behind technologically. When Japan finally developed radar surface search genuinely comparable to the American SG radar, it was 1945, and the war was almost over. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee never received full public credit during his lifetime for his profound understanding of how radar would change naval warfare. He received the Navy Cross for his actions at Guadalcanal and was promoted to Vice Admiral in 1944. But most popular histories of the Guadalcanal campaign focused on the desperate, chaotic surface actions of November 12th and 13. Lee's victory on the night of November 14th-15 received less public attention. But Lee's victory was actually much harder and required far more moral courage than it seemed. The decision to trust radar completely when most of the Navy's leadership considered it experimental was genuinely radical in November 1942. Lee gambled his entire force and the outcome of a strategically critical battle on technology that most of his peers viewed with considerable skepticism. Lee's true genius was in understanding that radar was actually more reliable than human vision in the darkness, and then having the moral and intellectual courage to act decisively based on that understanding, even when it contradicted decades of naval tradition. The USS Washington remained in active service throughout the war, participating in almost every major Pacific campaign from 1943 onward. After the war, Washington brought troops home. She was decommissioned on June 27, 1947, and eventually sold for scrap in 1961. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee never saw the end of the war. On August 25, 1945, just 10 days after Japan surrendered, Lee suffered a massive heart attack. He died before reaching the ship. He was 57 years old. Lee was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The engagement between USS Washington and Kirishima lasted exactly 7 minutes from the first salvo to cease fire. In those 7 minutes, Washington fired 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and 107 rounds of 5-inch. But the truly important lesson from the USS Washington's victory is not about the technology itself. It is about leadership that is willing to trust new technology when conventional wisdom says otherwise, about the courage to act based on knowledge rather than tradition, and about how innovation succeeds when study replaces guesswork. These lessons remain powerfully relevant today, more than 80 years later. Thank you very much for watching this deep dive into one of the most significant yet often overlooked naval battles of World War II. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, I would really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people discover these amazing pieces of history. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of history enthusiasts who believe these stories matter. Leave a comment below and tell me what surprised you most about this battle. I read every comment. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important victories are those that no one saw coming.